Welcome, everybody. This is the Steve Clemons Show. Here's my sidekick, Julia Manchester. If you didn't know, that was the world-famous tune to the Johnny Carson Show. Wait. And I don't really have a good tinfoil hat here, but I do have the Avery boxer, so let me put this on. You may remember Karnak the Magnificent.
Karnak the Magnificent. Are you thinking about, what are you thinking about? Drinking a cappuccino on Mars?
The future of mobility.
So
anyway,
good.
a little slapstick for us. That didn't go over as well as I'd hoped, but if there was a crowded room here, we would do it. I just thought for today that we have three fantastic speakers. When I'm thinking about the future of mobility, and I want to put my and Julia's prints on this, is I want to sort of bust this out a little bit. We've been talking about scooters, we've been talking about drones, we've been talking about bicycles at DelBene, but I think part of the question is, how do science and essentially an aspirational horizon come together with what's there? Do you agree, Ed? Julia?
No, definitely. I would love to see, I cover politics, for example, and we've really covered the, President Trump's idea of a space force, for example, and we've seen a lot of the intersectionality, I think, between big tech and politics and really where it leads from now. And I think it all starts from mobility. So we're really excited to talk to all of these great minds about this and really see what the future of this is and what we can see going down the road.
Well, what I really want to do is get some of the talent in this town up here who's thinking about this and thinking about data, a former Microsoft executive who happens to be one of the leading members of Congress on thinking about science, tech, mobility, and where we're going, co-chair of the Women's High Tech Caucus. Please welcome to the stage Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of the state of Washington. Suzan, great to see you. Come join. Yes, welcome. Welcome. I wish I had some monkeys or something up here. Right here.
No, you need the
so
big
welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. So Suzan, I'm interested in you. Let me first start out this morning. And I know this is a little bit off subject, but we had Congressman Rod Davis there. How many of you heard Rod Davis this morning? You guys deserve a medal for being here all day, so next time we'll arrange that. But something, they worked together on trying to modernize the Hill, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I understand one of the things that he was sort of complaining about is that the Hill is in the dark ages when it comes to technology. Is that true?
So we have a select committee to modernize Congress, and I serve on that committee with Congressman Davis.
He says we can't even really email.
He was also a former staffer, so he remembers what Congress was like as a staffer, but absolutely. People usually laugh when I say there's a committee to modernize Congress, and then people laugh, and I said, no, we have a lot of things we need to do to update the way we work, to use technologies, but also to just make sure we're more effective.
So he just said, and I think this is breaking news, that just last week, you guys got approval to use MailChimp. Is that correct? We've been using MailChimp for years.
It's a long time.
We are behind in our use of technology.
So why should we look to you for leadership on the future of transportation?
Well, some of us did a lot of work before we became members of Congress, and I think we have this interesting intersection between how we look at policy and how we look at technology issues, and we've got to bring those together. And so I think of myself as one of the geeks in Congress who hopefully can help us as we look at where innovation is taking us and look at technology and policy, and make sure that we have policy that really helps support innovation, but also protects consumers, make sure we have safety, all these things we have to pull together.
Julia, what zinger do you want to ask?
Right. Well, Congresswoman, you come from, you worked in tech before this, in science and tech, and now you're in Congress. And I would say, unfortunately, both industries have a very few women, not enough women at the table. So how, as a woman, have you been able to, bring original ideas to the table? And, how are you trying to encourage other women to get into science and technology or even run for office? Last year in 2018, we saw that groundswell of women and minorities enter into Congress.
A new high.
Right. So how are you going to achieve that in the science and technology space as well?
Well, I think there are numbers of things that we need to do. One, we need to make sure that everyone has a great education and opportunity and understands what the opportunities are when they're starting out. I think when we look at innovation and technology, innovation is really about creativity. And the only way we're going to be really successful in meeting the needs of people around the world is if we have diverse voices at the table who are representing all the issues that are there. And I think the challenge we have is without those voices, we're going to miss huge opportunities that can solve huge problems that we face. So I'm a co-chair of the Women's High Tech Coalition. I think it's important when we talk about education and talk about STEM that we talk about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, because again, creativity is so important. And show the connection between innovation and all sorts of areas. So whether it's technology and its impact on agriculture, technology in terms of devices and things that people use, being just a straight out programmer. There were some great innovators here on the Hill, this is a couple years ago, who were showing how they could actually change fashion by having technology kind of wires that could change the shape of clothing or change colors. There's all sorts of different ways that technology plays a role. And whatever it is that gets a person interested and excited about technology, and what you do the best learning things when you don't realize you're learning because you're having fun doing it. I think we need to make sure young people and young women in particular are exposed to all of those opportunities so they can continue to bring their skills to the table.
Congresswoman, you and I were at a party recently, and the party was a book party for Brad Smith, the president, general counsel of Microsoft, and he's got a new book out called Tools and Weapons, and is looking at these phenomenal technologies that are coming up. You know, we'll be able to do 3D printing of cars on islands. We'll be able to, have facial recognition that, good or bad, that, helps do things. That you'll have sensors. We were talking to some folks today about being able to do remote surgeries in real time without any lag because of 5G infrastructure. And today we've been talking about all sorts of layered options, from micro mobility to bigger mobility, that essentially changes the waste equation, among other things. I'm interested, Tools and Weapons was both about the promise of what could come up, but also the dark side of what could happen. I'm interested, what do you think this dark side of the future of mobility could be?
Well, I think that trust is a huge part of people's acceptance of technology, really acceptance of anything. And I think originally when we were kind of doing some of the first innovations, especially in computing, it was all positive. People thought, oh, this is great. This will be a breakthrough. It's going to solve problems. And I think now we are seeing those challenges and that breach of trust where information's being used in ways people don't expect. They aren't quite sure. When you talk about mobility, what's happening to all that data about where I'm going, the information that someone's collecting, that I went from here to here and then I went from there to there. So I believe very strongly that we need federal privacy policy for consumers. Consumers need to control their data. And so again, as policymakers, we need to put those policies in place. Technology moved forward very, very quickly, and policy didn't. And so we're behind. And whether it's privacy, which is a really core foundational element of making sure people have control over the data, to making sure that people know if you're going to use my data, that not only do you get my consent, but I actually know I gave you my consent knowing what you're going to do with that data. That building that trust is going to be critically important, I think, in all areas of technology, and mobility is no different, because once again, the second you hop in a car and go somewhere, someone knows where you've been. What do you want to happen to that data, or do you know what happens with that data? We've got to make sure consumers are aware and making those educated choices.
So the American mobility scene has changed so much just within the past 5 years. You've seen the emergence of Uber, Lyft, other ride-sharing apparatuses. You're seeing, these scooters pop up all around town. It's changing rapidly. But do you think Congress has been slow to adapt to the changing mobility scene? I mean, we talk about infrastructure in the United States being so outdated, but how do you,
Does anybody scooter to work to the Capitol?
I'm too afraid to.
I'm sure someone does, because there are enough scooters hanging around by the Capitol that someone's used.
Right.
One, I think we're behind on policy with respect to technology, kind of across the board. Two, when we talk about infrastructure, we really do need to be looking at what the future of infrastructure should look like. We don't just want to build what we had before. What should we be building now that makes sense? And so one of the pieces of legislation, for example, that I have out is about smart cities and smart communities, making sure that we are providing funding for communities to basically do pilots, to try technologies, whether it's with traffic management, looking at energy efficiency, different ways that you may be using technology to help a city or help a region, and learning what works in some places, what doesn't work, which can inform federal policy and also help inform other communities of what to do. Because the challenge with brand new technologies, when you're, any of you who've been the beta testers out there trying something out, is that, and when you're a city official or government official, is that you can't afford necessarily to always experiment. People want things to work. So the question is, can we have pilots where a few folks are trying things and then figure out, hey, this works great in this scenario, so maybe you want to use these technologies here, but don't use them here, so that everybody's getting that shared learning. And part of our legislation is about combining that data information back together, bringing agencies together that touch all of these different areas, so that there is this growing shared knowledge of what works, what doesn't work. You know, if you're in this scenario, you want to use this. If you want to do this for traffic management, here's things to think about. So really, technologies are effective, because I think one of the challenges, and maybe even in the House, why we might be behind in technology, you know, I used to run the Department of Revenue for the state of Washington. Technology for a long time was seen as a nice to have, right? It wasn't a foundational element for an organization. And then it shifted, and now I'd say it absolutely is a must have. It is infrastructure for organization. But money didn't get allocated always to update and buy newer technologies. And many times governments spent money on technologies that didn't give you the results that you wanted. A lot of money, the project didn't work. So we need to really prove what works, so that when public dollars are invested, they get a great return on that investment. The community gets a great return on that investment, because you don't necessarily want all that cutting edge new technology out there if it's not proven.
Are you interested in space?
I think, actually, when we talk about even what we're doing right now, and we talk about mobility, and you're going to talk about communications and satellites, et cetera, we already are talking about space.
Cool. Well, I'm going to tell you something. I mean, this before you got to Congress, but years ago, we all talk kind of, you know, just easily now about the cloud. What many people don't know is that the idea of the cloud at some point was first promulgated, at least in my experience, by Microsoft. And so Microsoft came to me early on, I was in the think tank days, and they came in and said, we're going to try to educate people to trust the cloud, to think and envision the cloud. And so they created a game, actually, to kind of walk people through it. And guess what the game dealt with? Mars, and going to Mars.
I know someone who's really excited about
Guess what? Yes, and here to join us on stage is Ellen Stofan, who is head of the National Air and Space Museum, former chief scientist of NASA. Absolutely Mars, but this is entirely true. Microsoft dedicated a whole thing because, I mean, in anything, I remember when we started the New America Foundation in 1999, our first grant was to help lawyers and people at home and farmers to understand how their lives were going to change from the internet. And then Microsoft was one of the first to kind of begin creating an interactive process, beta tested for a number of people, and I was included, on basically going to Mars. But this was years ago, and I don't know if it was inspired by you, Ellen, but Ellen and I have met. So good to have you on the show.
I was wondering how you're going to switch to Mars. That was a really interesting transition there. Yeah.
So, but thank you for joining us. So Ellen, you're for any of you who haven't been over there, the National Air and Space Museum and any of its components, she's in charge, you know, so thank you for that, because it's a wonderful museum. I think we should give her a round of applause. I don't know why you left chief scientist job at NASA. So, but in any case, how is it, I mean, while we have the Congresswoman with us, what could they do that they're not doing? What could Suzan be a champion for to help in which I know we were going to call your session Mars or Bust?
Well, you know, what I heard the representative just talking about, to me, what you were talking about is exactly what we do need. And the whole reason that I'm at the Air and Space Museum is how do we use this amazing story of this defiance of gravity to get into air and up into space? How do we use that to inspire the next generation of innovators and explorers? And how do we make sure that they look like our entire population? How do we make sure we're telling all the stories? Because we have to make sure that we change the face of STEM to look more like the face of our population. We've got to do it. It's an economic imperative. It's a moral imperative. And at the Air and Space Museum, our job is to light that spark, to inspire that kid to say, I'm going to be the first girl to walk on Mars.
Wow.
And where does that start? Do you need to encourage, I think, speaking from experience, I think a lot of young women often aren't encouraged to go into science and technology, maybe not until recently. There really didn't seem to be at least much of an effort. So, I've heard about different programs maybe starting in 6th grade to really encourage women to get involved, or young girls to get involved in these programs. But, give me an idea of how the Smithsonian and other organizations are really trying to encourage and recruit these young women.
Well, first of all, we have to base it on research, right? And the research used to say that girls tend to, white girls and people of color tend to turn away from STEM subjects in middle school. So a lot of our programming had been really heavily aimed at that sort of 11, 12, 13-year-old kid. How do we engage them? How do we inspire them? How do we make them realize that science is more than memorizing a bunch of facts? It's hands-on, it's curiosity, it's puzzle solving, it's using innovation and curiosity to tackle the big problems that face us. So how do we get them to think that way? We get to do the fun part in the museum world, that inspiration part. Research is actually now pushing that age back younger. So we're talking about mid-elementary school, late elementary school. So we're having to broaden our focus from just middle school to even younger kids, because we know that's when they start getting discouraged about STEM subjects. But it's a pipeline issue that is not sufficient. Our job in the museum world is to tackle that elementary school kid through middle school kid. But we have to recognize, if we really do want to change the face of STEM, it goes far beyond that.
Let me ask you both. Susan, let me just, and I know you've got some obligations you have to do, but I want to ask this question. You've worked on legislation called the Smart Cities and Communications Act, or Communities Act, excuse me. And I was at the Air and Space Museum the other day, and when you walk around, you sort of look at all these things we created and that moved at extraordinary speeds that were revolutionary in their time. And it just makes me think about the ecosystem of science and how we invest in it right. What are the pieces that are wobbly today? And as we think about smart cities and communities in the future, I also think about what we built in NASA, what we built in supersonic flight, the invention of the jet engine, which many people think is and so much of this came out of Washington State, where you are as well, with Boeing and whatnot in the old days. And so I'm interested in that act that you're working on. What's the heavy lifting there? And are you worried about the health of our science ecosystem today?
Well, at the end there, I am worried about the health of the ecosystem. One, we have to value and invest in research. And not just NIH, which is critically important, but think broadly, NSF, and all the areas where great innovation is happening. I think there's been concern with research funding that we become more risk averse, which is kind of strange when you think about the whole point of innovation is to take risk and to try things, and they may not work. And actually, when they don't work the way you expected, sometimes you learn something great. That's a huge breakthrough. But I know when you talk to young scientists, it's harder for them because they're not as proven to get those grants. So if we're going to expect young people to go into science, they have to know there's a path, that they have the ability to get funding to do work. We know that it's, as you were just saying, it's not just encourage, it's don't discourage as well. Let people know the opportunity, see role models, see others, know that you have a successful future and your great ideas are going to have an opportunity to move forward. So we need to teach that from an educational standpoint, but we need to collectively invest in that and make sure those opportunities.
And real quickly on your legislation?
So on the legislative side, the bill creates grant opportunities for pilots, for people to try things, for communities to try things, so that they don't necessarily have to use their small number of dollars to implement and try new technologies, and then their great learnings are shared by others, and we want to make sure that there are
a little R&D, a little show and tell.
And a little practical implementation, so we know if it really gives folks the return on investment.
Susan, thank you for joining us. Glad to have you on the show. Hope to have you back another time.
Thank you.
Soon. Good. Let's give her a round of applause for joining us. Susan DelBene, thank you so much.
Thank
Ellen,
you.
now we're going to focus on you. We have another guest who will be joining us in just a little bit, who's sort of the one of the cool advocates for science in the administration. We'll talk about this. But I'm interested in, you are obsessed with getting to Mars. What do we need to get to Mars?
Well, first of all, I want to step back and say why. Why am I obsessed with this? What's up with that? So we know that about 3.5 billion years ago, the conditions on Mars were very similar to the conditions on the early Earth, in fact, around the time that life evolved. And so given that Mars had all the same kind of ingredients that the Earth had, life probably should have evolved on Mars also. But then Mars became cold. Any life there probably would have gone extinct or gone underground. And so to find that evidence of past life, and we're talking microbes, not little green men, to find that evidence of past life, I really do think it's going to take boots on the ground. It's going to take people breaking open a lot of rocks to not just find, all right, here's a little indicator of life, but to what extent did life evolve on Mars, and how can we use that information to help us not only understand life here on Earth, but the potential for life in solar systems far beyond our own.
One of the areas I've been interested in, you and I talked about this at Georgia Tech, I think, in the past, and we had the Curiosity Land Rover, right? And Siemens helped develop a piece of this, but I learned that Curiosity had a female gender, which was great, the Land Rover. But in the process of it, it was interesting to learn and to hear from you and other scientists about all the different pieces of science that had to converge and come together. You had to have advances in physics, advances in data and quantum computing, and you had to bring in a lot of pieces that were there. And we've got another guest who's about to join us, but as you are in this field and you're sort of looking at this when you were at NASA, are there any lagging areas of science that are keeping us from moving forward?
That's a really interesting question. I've been thinking about that a lot in the past year because we've been celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission. And so when you think of where they started, when President Kennedy gave that famous speech in 1962, we choose to go to the moon, I won't do the accent. We didn't have a rocket. We didn't have life support systems. We didn't have, what we didn't have the math. We didn't know how to navigate to the moon and back. We knew nothing. And yet in 8.5 years, we made it to the moon. So when people ask me, what are the technological barriers to get humans to Mars? You're like, no problem. There are problems. There are technological barriers, but let's put them in perspective. There are concerns about radiation. Entry, descent, and landing on Mars is really hard. There are issues we have to tackle, but boy, compared to where we were when we started with Apollo, we're good.
That's great. And
oh yeah, no, I just wanted to step back and ask more of a global question. Do we have time for one more?
We do, but let me bring in our
yes, of course.
Ed?
Of course,
Julia?
yes.
And while we're doing this, I just want to say that I've been offered a number of jobs in previous presidential administrations, and I've said no every time. The only job I thought I would take is policy planning at state, until I read about Paul Dabbar. So Paul Dabbar, so great to have you. Welcome to the stage, Paul Dabbar. Paul is Undersecretary of Energy for Science and the Department of Energy, and I'm not trying to make you feel good, I'm not into making people feel good or whatever, but DOE is the most mislabeled department in government because you dabble in so many things that have nothing to do with energy. Or maybe they do, but you really affect the future of mobility and the transportation picture that we see of what we're going to in a lot of ways. And so I want to bring you up as the science guy, not the NPR science guy. I actually don't know how cool you are. I'm hoping you're cooler than people think. But in terms of this question, with Ellen, of thinking about what are the investments that we need to make, whether it's quantum. I got a lesson in 5G this morning. I said 5G is not 5G. 5G is AI. 5G is quantum computing. There are these pieces that come together. 5G's just become a brand, but it's filled with all these other elements. So let me ask you the same question. If you were going to help put Ellen on Mars, what do you need to fund as a very smart bureaucrat to get her there?
Yeah, so luckily we get to work with NASA a lot. We have about 80 projects going on with NASA across the lab complex. And just a real quick point, so the Department of Energy to a large degree is a large research university. We have 17 campuses. We have 60,000 researchers. It's the largest R&D organization in the world at Los Alamos and Berkeley and Brookhaven, and it's the largest generator of Nobel Prize winners in the world. And physics and chemistry are the two areas that we had. And so what to a large degree, what's been, and people I think miss it in this town of what's happened unless you're really into the budget, is that actually the support for the sciences has ballooned in the last 3 years. Our budgets for the sciences, which is give or take around $14 billion in research for non-defense, is up over 25%, and it's already proposed again to go up a lot. And so there's tremendous increase, all-time highs in NSF and NIH and others. So what do we need to do with all this great support, and how do we kind of move forward mobility? I think to a large degree, at least from my point of view, I deal a lot with the universities, so it's both us as very large research university as well as universities, is the engagement, right? It's a two-way communication, or another way to say it is use-inspired research. So there's a lot of things going on in the university system and the national labs, but it's actually engaging with the people who want to use that, who can see what's going on in quantum or in mobility and what's being worked on, and about how do we deploy it, and vice versa, how do we get the input from customers, NASA's kind of a customer to us, about, hey, we need to see this, so that we can direct the research dollars to try to make those giant jumps.
You know, I was really interested a couple weeks ago. India is very much investing a lot into their space program, and I just wanted to ask more of a global question to both of you as to where you see, I guess, if you see a reinvented global space race, or more competition in terms of space, and what's in store for the U.S. in the future. We've seen that the Trump administration has proposed and gotten into this Space Force, which is new, but just wanted to get your take on the future of this industry.
I think we're looking at more cooperation than competition, and it's great because the best minds are located all around the world. Space is hard, space is expensive. So the more nations you have involved, the more people you have involved, the further you're going to go. And so when you look at things like NASA's big push to get back to the moon with Artemis, then going on to Mars, that needs to be an international effort, not just a national
The
effort.
UAE just put their first astronaut in space yesterday.
Yep.
You know, if you're in the UN, I mean, there were other distracting news items yesterday, but for the UAE, what was big was putting an astronaut in space yesterday, so that's part of the story. Let me ask you a question, not to nitpick on numbers, but because I do know that you're doing this, you know, that maybe it was just the Trump administration start, but I you know, look at the NSF budgets, and, you know, looking at it was about $8 billion for this year. The administration came in with like a $7 billion request, so I wondered, you know, why don't we come in and request $24 billion? Like, let's triple NSF.
Do you really want to get into the sequester conversation in this?
Yeah, maybe not. So, but anyway, I want to make sure that there. But you know, as you look at this, and when I had the privilege, really, I mean, it was such a surprising conversation because DOE was one of the places that Rick Perry thought he wanted to get rid of. But I interviewed him as secretary, and he knows that building and he knows the functions. And we talked a lot about how the massive supercomputing capacity of DOE was being applied to major health questions. So I'm interested in what, in this topic of cities in the future, we had Suzan DelBene up here, and the future of the technological leaps we're going to make. What are you contributing to the smart cities future and to the future of mobility?
So, you know, another part of the much misunderstood area of the Department of Energy and the National Lab Complex is that we're the leaders in supercomputing in the world, and have been since the Cray 1. So we are constantly pushing, so our major contractors are Intel and Cray and IBM. We're the major instigators of moving the next supercomputer, the next semiconductor chip. We're the ones who help design it, and then we're the first purchasers. We just deployed the #1 and #2 supercomputers in the world, including the top AI supercomputers in the world. And so we have this massive capability beyond anyone else in the world, top in the world in terms of this hardware. And as a result, we're always constantly looking at problems, right? How do we take this kind of capability on science and so on? So for mobility, we do a lot of different aspects. So I'll give you an example. One of the autonomous driving companies is co-located at one of our national labs out in California, and they run simulations for their autonomous driving software on our computer every day, where they're basically, instead of taking the car out and potentially having an accident, they basically take the software and drive it on our supercomputer.
So is it public knowledge which?
I'm not certain, and I'd like to stay quiet about that, but take that aside.
Will somebody Google that, please?
Yeah. So literally, they're driving their software right, their car, on our supercomputers, so they can come back every morning. Right? It's running overnight. They can come back in the morning and say, okay, this is where a failure was in the software, right, in terms of all this different simulations, and they can update it, and it's frankly much faster, right, to develop autonomous driving software or other software through these sort of very high-end simulations. And when you're trying to model San Francisco, right, in terms of the roads and all the different options and so on, that's a much more efficient and frankly safe way to develop that.
Daniel, Daniel. I was just thinking Daniel Burr was a mover. Ellen, when you're now head of Air and Space Museum, and I'm interested in you're a museum of more than 60,000 subjects. If you project 10 years ahead, what should we have in your museum that we don't have today in the?
Well, what we don't have today is something that we're going to open in 2023, I think, which is a whole new gallery on future innovation. Because traditionally, we used to change galleries sort of every 10 years, and yet we're the Air and Space Museum, and things are moving at a slightly more rapid pace than that. So we're going to have a gallery that we're going to focus on future innovation. The exhibits will change every 6 months to 18 months. And we're going to do things like talk about urban aerial mobility and how are we using artificial intelligence in aviation and space exploration. So these cutting edge topics that, are we going to go back to supersonic flight, and are we actually going to move on to hypersonic flight? Tons of issues around mobility. But part of my purpose for having this gallery is let's educate the public on what are these issues, what are the upsides, what are the downsides, and you as the public actually have agency in creating the future. Because a lot of the times I feel like we feel like the future is something that happens to us rather than something that we have agency in. And so my goal in talking about these things at the Air and Space Museum is really to get people to say, what is happening right now and what does that potentially imply about what the future is going to look like?
Right. Paul, talk to us about, how the Department of Energy, and if the Department of Energy is working collaboratively with companies really to create new technologies to meet mobility needs. I mean, we've been talking all day about how mobility in the US with the advent of Uber, Lyft, even e-scooters or whatever, it's changing so rapidly. So how is the department?
So small bird jump, Rebel,
right, exactly.
Happy Tracker.
Listing them all out.
Yeah.
So how is the department working, I guess, to help these companies stay relevant and to continue to grow?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, as the largest investor in basic science in the physical science area, we have all these different research streams that we fund across the lab complex and send out grant money. We're one of the largest supporter of grants all around the university system, about $3 billion a year. But so we have lots of different things going on, but let me give you one example. We're a very forward leader in chemistry in the world. And so one of the big areas, and the Senate just passed a bill that we asked them to pass on battery and storage efforts. So if you take a look at the chemistry area in batteries, lithium ion is now frankly economic without mandates or incentives. The technology improvement that has occurred in lithium ion has been dramatic. But we're at the point of saying that's not good enough. So we're looking at a whole series of chemistries depending on whether it's life science applications for medical devices, for stationary, for utilities, for mobility, whether it's cars or aero, that are chemistries that are beyond lithium ion. And there's various different metrics, too long to get into here, but we're looking at performance metrics for next generation chemistries that are beyond lithium ion that are 3 to 5 times current performance. So imagine a car that could go 1,000 miles of charge, 1,200 miles of charge. It's actually longer than a gas tank. And there's applications for utilities and renewable power and so on, but just from a mobility point of view, that would be dramatic, right? If we could get the power to weight ratio down, right, some of the aero aspects for batteries would be dramatic if we can cut it by 80%. So those are some of the, I think that's probably the most exciting thing that we're doing at the very cutting edge that could have real applicability.
Let me ask you a final question before we go to the audience for whatever questions. I want to thank everybody for being really great after a long day. We had a fascinating woman here earlier, Susie Armstrong of Qualcomm. Susie brought the phone, in which she helped invent in 1996, 1997, the first interaction between a phone and the web, and the phone and video, and the phone and photos. And so I sent out a note to people, a bunch of journalists yesterday, say, hey, you should come meet the person, who enabled you to read the note that you're getting from me right now over the web. But I asked her this morning, I said, she was part of the R&D process of Qualcomm. They didn't know it was going to be such a big deal at that time. Of course, it's been revolutionary. And I guess, I asked her, what are some of the flops that Qualcomm, what's still on the shelf that nobody's, discovered? And she shared a few, but it was off the record, so I can't share with you what the good ideas are that haven't been exploited. But I am interested in how we simulate and envision a future. This phone, the main technology, not that old. And so when you begin to envision the choices that we have to get right for, say, 10 years from now, where you imagine robotic surgery, you imagine things that are going to be very capable with the density of sensors, the density of data, the density of operations, that gets over this. What are the things you worry about getting wrong when you vision that? Because I just wonder about how you get on the right track so that you bumped into the innovation that's transformative, bank shot, versus what you were sharing as you think ahead, that we can make some dumb choices, right? That get the United States stuck in a position while maybe others make better decisions. Paul?
Well, given at least kind of from my perspective, the breadth of the sort of research, I think if we try to go too narrow, if we try to pick technologies too early, I think that's a really bad idea. And there's examples of different things, whether in the energy sector or so on, in which people said, this is the only way to go, the technology has to be X. And I live in a world in which people literally take things off the shelf from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago, and say, wait a minute, given some evolution in technology that didn't happen back then, such as kind of new advances for nuclear, for propulsion in space, there was an idea from the 50s that printing technologies today could get to scales and sizes small enough that could really make a dramatic difference. It was an idea from the 50s, didn't work, but maybe now works. So I do think keeping your mind open, making certain that you go back and look at things that Niels Bohr predicted 100 years ago, and only now quantum computing is really going to be worthwhile. That's a great example from 100 years ago.
So do you ever catch yourself saying to somebody, oh, that's a stupid idea, and you say, wait, I can't do that, that might be a billion-dollar industry in the future?
Yeah, so, I think at the end of the day, a lot of what we do as chief scientist, right, in your old job and us, is how do you keep your mind open and realize that these things may go places that you didn't exactly know. And that's what's important about the federal footprint, right? The federal footprint is more in the discovery science area, and as compared to the private sector, and the private sector is needed to deploy things. But it's our job to say what if and give it a little bit of money to see where it goes.
And Ellen, what's the wildest, craziest idea in the past that seemed just outlandish that has been critical that you've seen develop?
That I've seen develop. There's so many things that I can't even think of a single one, because this cuts across so many issues, whether it's how we communicate with the spacecraft, how we measure things on the surface, the fact that we just imaged a black hole. Okay, that would probably be pretty high on my list. My favorite program at NASA was one called the NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Program. And NASA would set aside a certain amount of research dollars every year. And I used to call them wacky ideas. The people at NIAC would say, please don't call them wacky. They were ideas that were out there. Submarines on Titan, little tiny spacecraft that could spin a giant structure in space that you could build a big telescope on. So what are these almost science fiction areas of research that we can put some research dollars in? Most of them are going to fail, but you might just hit on something. So make sure you're defining, I think Paul really hit it, make sure you're defining the problem, not the solution, and invest in research dollars. The congressman hit it on the head. When we narrow research funding, we crush innovation. There's no two ways around it.
I'm going to go to the audience, Julia, unless you want to ask her about UFOs.
Oh, yeah. that's a whole black hole.
Whole nother
yes.
future mobility. I've been watching these UFO files in the New York Times that have been released, whatever. Are they real?
You know, so when I speak to elementary school audiences, and I hope you do the same thing when you talk to them, I always give them as an assignment for that night to go home and invent warp drive. We use basically the same propulsion technologies to get to space that we used in the 1960s. When we are imaging these planets around other stars, which we hope to be able to do in 20 or 30 years, right now we're just detecting planets around other stars. The possibility of getting to them is so far away because the distances in our universe, in our galaxy, are gigantic. We don't have warp drive. We're not even close. And so to me, when I talk to little kids, I'm like, go home and invent warp drive tonight, because it's going to take a
Best
crazy
UFO answer I've heard yet.
So why would, if someone had that technology, which we're not even close to, why would they come here, carve some patterns in a cornfield, and leave?
Right.
So,
And why would they be hungry? I don't get why they're always hungry. If you can invent warp drive, you can feed yourself.
so the best suggestion I got was from my high school son, who said, you know, Dad, I got an idea to get your Twitter followers up. And he said, if you tweet that if you get 100,000 followers in the next day, additional 100,000, that you would tell everyone about the aliens. So I have not tweeted that. That would be dangerous.
Let's get a few questions in here right. It's right here.
It would work.
My name's Ann Broom. This is really a thank you to Dr. Stofan for the Apollo 50 celebration. And those, here's a Washingtonian, those projections on the monument that you do all
Yeah.
3 nights in a row.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Fascinating.
Thousands of kids that just were awestruck.
Right.
And so
Right.
right there you made an impact.
Yeah, you know, we had over 500,000 people come out over the 2 nights that we had the Go for the Moon show. If you haven't seen it, the video is on the web. I cry every time I watch it. But we wanted to, how do you inspire, you know, the bulk of the population today was not alive during Apollo, unlike me. And so how do we inspire them? How do you make people realize that as Americans, when we put our mind to doing something, we can accomplish it in amazing ways.
Thank you. Right in the back.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Could you tell us a bit more about the beyond lithium-ion batteries?
Well, so there's multiple different chemistries, right? So you have some that are solid state that help on safety. You have some that drive down costs quite a bit. So you can have sulfur batteries, you can have flow batteries. Each one of these are different applications. And one of the things that most people don't realize about how the complex works is that we work with private companies all the time in terms of this research. So at Argonne alone, we have 80 different companies that we do work with, whether it's optimizing some current chemistries or brand new chemistries. And so, you know, it's not just about kind of our dollars, but it's our engagement with the private sector. We're very, very bullish on what can be accomplished.
And with that, I thank you for putting up with my silly antics. It's been a good, fun, fascinating day. Paul Dabbar, thank you from the Department of Energy. Ellen Stofan from the National Air and Space Museum. Ed McMahon, Julia Manchester, thank you so much for joining us today. And I just want to say something in conclusion before my colleague Peter Greenberger says this. I really think that what we were trying to do in these summits with the Hill, and I'm saying this for those people watching here, is to kind of bring together all the stakeholders in some big, important public policy question, and and from every angle kind of do that. And I want to thank those of you who've made it through a very long day. Started at 7 in the morning with me interviewing Susie Armstrong on some of the issues of how to get some of these technology R&D bets, not right, but basically to do what Paul and Ellen both said, how to keep an open mind and how to keep the flow of ideas and resources and investment, how to keep the ecosystem smart so that we can kind of have these great things happen. So I want to thank everybody for your time, particularly because this is a long day, and as we can tell, some people have distractions elsewhere in town, but we kept our eye on the ball today. So thank you all very much. Paul, thank you.
Thank you.
Ellen, thank you, dear. Thank you so much.